Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and this is a one-on-one interview and we are joined once again by Ben Jacobs. Now, first of all, Ben, it's very good to get you back on, but let's just get straight into this because there has been some bizarre and strange goings on surrounding Manchester United's takeover or maybe lack of takeover, in particular from the Qatari bid. You were tweeting about this sort of back and forth with almost, it seemed like, talking directly to the Qatar bid itself. What is your understanding of this whole idea that the bid never really was what they said it was, and then sort of the all the extra stuff on top of that of basically it's seeming as though the PR not really matching the reality of that supposed Qatari bid?
I think that's right. And it was alluded to throughout the process. This isn't the first time that we've had a narrative from the Qatar side and then a narrative from those close to the sellers. It was quite persistent during the process, but obviously when one bit came out and then it was countered and then it was reported that way, there was so much confusion and at times criticism that I think it got lost in the sale process. But this isn't new. Those close to the selling side had said consistently that if Qatar's PR was the reality, then they may have already won. But the SEC filing suggests it wasn't. So again, we've got the same two sides, but now the selling side, having not been able to ultimately respond with any detail during the process, can actually release this document. And it's a regulatory requirement to be as honest as possible. And if you're not, you can face criminal charges. So it's there in black and white. It's quite juicy, and it backs up what a lot of sources were saying during the process, that maybe Qatar were not who they said they were, at least in a PR sense. But for balance, the Qataris are saying that they still stand by all of their narrative and they may seek a corrective statement. So in simple terms, and obviously it's a document that anybody can read, you have two things that I think are quite clear from the SEC filing. And that is, number one, that Qatar never provided a customary finance letter at any stage in the process. And each stage of bidding required that to be resubmitted because it's a new bid. So you have to back that up with the customary financial commitment letter. And number two, Qatar, even after the board told them to, did not give equal share considerations to A and B. In other words, much like Ratcliffe when he pivoted in July, the A and B shares had to be the same amount. Otherwise, there was potential legal action that could have been taken. And the board made that clear to all parties. And yet, Qatar's listed offers still show a different price for B and A shares, with the B one being higher because they're ultimately more powerful. So I think the questions that raises over the legitimacy of the Qatar bid are valid. The counterpoint is that Qatar say things work differently. They argue they provided financial guarantees in a different form via a bank guarantee, which was signed by the CEO of Qatar National Bank. And they also maintain that even though none of their offers add up to above $5 billion US, their actual offer by the time it got to the final stages was as high as almost $6 billion US. And in addition to that, there was this $1.7 billion US of pledged investment. So we've got two narratives, but maybe the difference is during the process, Qatar sources were perhaps speaking a bit more freely and selling side sources were more coy. And now it's kind of flipped, and the selling side can release something in black and white, which has a regulatory requirement to be truthful and honest. And Qatar have countered that and said that there are emissions and that they are seeking potentially a corrective statement. But whether they follow through on that remains to be seen, because those close to the selling side and those close to Manchester United are adamant that they're perfectly happy with the SEC filing. They believe it to be truthful and accurate and reflective of the process. And if that is correct, then ultimately it shows us those 2 points, that Qatar did not give equal share price consideration to A and B, and they did not provide effectively proof of funds in the formal sense that was being asked anyway throughout the entire process. And to many, that sheds a new light on the validity and the credibility of the Qatar bid.
Do you think that's the way that this is unfolding? Do you think it, for me, two things spring to mind. One is that the whole thing was a little bit of a sort of almost a PR stunt and a way to attach themselves to the name and the brand of Manchester United, raise the profile of Sheikh Jassim and potentially further other bids for other clubs, whilst not actually, being really in the ring for it. Obviously, the other option would be that what you said and what they've said is true, and that they offered this proof of funds in a different way. But also the sort of the third option of, maybe the money, and people sort of hinted and suggested this the whole time, and the 9-2 Foundation and the money would be perhaps coming from elsewhere, or the government or the royal family, and that it would have to have been funneled through the new foundations and these sort of more traditional means after any bid was accepted. Is that suggestion got any weight to it, do you think? Or do you think it is maybe just a miscommunication of how the money was going to be transferred, or the proof was going to be put together afterwards?
I think there's something in that suggestion. And you may remember I came on here repeatedly and said that many sources say that Qatar's vehicle is not ready to go. And maybe it is a case of winning and there being a implicit trust that the funds would arrive, which is why they got so far in the process. But then only after you've won do you formally finance the vehicle. And the only logical reason why that would be the case is either Sheikh Jassim hadn't found all of the backers, or the backers were there, but they didn't want to come forwards. And it's very logical that in a formal, customary financing commitment letter, you may have to show the source of funds, and that may have created questions as to who was actually part of this bid. Because I don't even think those affiliated to Rain Group and Manchester United could be 100% sure who was with Jassim on this, because all the inquiries originally were from slightly odd people. A former US governor made a call to Rain Group on behalf of the Qataris. We know there were Bank of America advisors, and there were countless other intermediaries, including, of course, Nasser Al-Khalifi, who the Glazers asked to mediate. And that was at the Glazers' request. And that maybe tells you that nobody was absolutely sure who was flanking Jassim in this bid. So is he Sheikh Jassim with his funds, a private businessman, or is this all coming from the Emir? And if it's from the Emir, then should Sheikh Jassim, the face of the bid, have been successful, would the rest of the funding have emerged to have come from those with links to the Emir and links to the government, and potentially, if not formally, links to those connected with QSI, which is ultimately the sports arm of the Qatari government. And if you provide a customary financing letter, then maybe that would have had to reveal more information than the Qataris wanted to. So they chose instead to get a bank guarantee from the CEO of Qatar National Bank that was, in their eyes, perhaps how business is done in Qatar, and equally as legitimate, but maybe lacking in the same detail that was required, and also not playing the process. And you can't win a takeover this public, the same for Chelsea, unless you play the process. And the feeling with Qatar is that they played the media and they played the PR game. But again, as you said right at the beginning, the PR did not quite match the reality. And the SEC filing backs that up. And it's all very well countering it. And we should, as journalists, provide balance, which is why I broke the exclusive that Qatar are seeking a corrective statement. So again, there's two sides, but it's very easy for one side that hasn't won, that is out the process, to in the aftermath challenge it and seek that. But if they're successful, it's basically saying that the 50 plus Glazers lawyers are under threat of being disbarred. It's saying that the SEC filing is not in keeping with the regulatory commitments. And it's saying that not only are there omissions, but there are factual inaccuracies that reflect Qatar in not just a poor light, but do so fictitiously and fraudulently, because the specifics of the bids are there. So we can debate until we're blue in the face the proof of funds, but if we put that to one side for a moment, the bids are there. Add up the bid, and the bid doesn't come to anywhere near $6 billion US. It doesn't even come to $5 billion US at any stage throughout the process. And then the pledged investment has no relevance to the process. So unless those numbers are incorrect and Qatar can show that there is written evidence they bid differently, I struggle to believe that they're going to succeed in getting a corrective statement. But I think it's important to point out that there may be a feeling in the Qatar camp that things such as proof of funds are compiled and presented differently. But this is not a Qatar tender. This is a Rain Group tender. So regardless of your culture, regardless of how you do things, you ultimately have to go through the box ticks of what the process requires. And if you don't, then there's very little chance in any takeover that you're going to succeed, which is why also Ratcliffe didn't succeed with Chelsea, because he went to Rain Group outside of the process at the last minute and said, I've got the money. I want to buy Chelsea. Here's my offer. I've not been part of the process. You're already basically in exclusivity with Clearlake Bowley, but I want to enter Rogue. And guess what? That damaged his relationship with Rain, and he didn't win. And then with this particular process, he showed, I think, smartness and an element of contrition and played the process by the book. And in doing so, he won over Rain Group, he won over the Glazers, and ultimately he's got his 25% stake in Manchester United with that few extra percent in the 300 million of pledged investment. And just the last thing I want to say, because I think it's worth explaining, is that 300 million from Ratcliffe is in the SEC filing because it's in return for shares. So there is an obligation to obviously explain that and acknowledge that, which is why the total percentage is not 25, it's 28 almost, because the extra 3 or so percent are for the 300 million of investment. So a lot of people are saying, well, why is the Qatar pledged investment not acknowledged? It's because it's not for shares, it's not binding, and it wasn't part of the process. Yeah. So there's no real need to acknowledge that, but you have to acknowledge the Ratcliffe pledged investment, because it's not just pledged investment, it's pledged investment that is formal, binding, and in return for shares.
Very interesting, isn't it? And like you said, it's all you have to do, and the only way you're going to make it work is by playing the game of the seller. The power isn't in the hands of the buyer here; it's in the hands of the seller, isn't it? So if you don't do it the way they want you to, then regardless of any investment or not, you're not going to get the sort of the bid accepted, as we've seen. Let's move on a little bit then to transfers potentially. Now, we're in the 19th of January. Before the window opened, at the start of the window, there was rumours, there was strikers being mentioned, there was United potentially want a centre-back, maybe Varane will go somewhere, this, that. Now everything seems to have gone cold. Timo Werner, who was one of the options, played against Man United the other day for Tottenham, so obviously we're not getting him. Choupo-Moting is another name that's mentioned. Just in terms of potential ins, do you see United going for anyone in the January transfer window?
I think they'll be opportunistic. There's this transfers plan that's been approved by Ratcliffe, and it doesn't necessarily have a big budget or a defined list of targets as far as striker is concerned, because outgoings were the priority. So there was no fee for Sancho, but Manchester United believe they'll break even or better because that total package might be 7.5 million euros. And then if they were to get Martial out the door, and it is an if, because the agent came out and obviously said that he'll stay until June, then that's potentially a fee, or at least getting him off the wage bill. And suddenly you have a situation where Manchester United can move. But if we take the agent at his word and Martial will now stay, and there was definitely not a willingness to entertain any Saudi offers for Martial in this window. John Murta went out to Saudi Arabia in and around the Club World Cup, and it was more for relationships than necessarily offering up players. But it was clear from the Martial camp that was there to be a Saudi suitor mid-season, it wasn't a move that he wanted to entertain. So then it's harder for Manchester United to move in the market, because they're either looking at budget options or short-term options. So I've said many times right at the beginning of the window as well that Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting is one to watch for Manchester United right up until the end of the window, and he would be open to a move. The stumbling block is Bayern. They really value him, even though Harry Kane has still come in. I think he's only played 15 Bundesliga games and scored 2 goals, but he's a squad player that Bayern still value. And that's because last season he did exceptionally well, scoring 17 goals in all competitions and I think 10 goals in only 19 Bundesliga games. And that was just about the most productive season of his career, certainly recent career. I think you would probably have to go back to the early days at Mainz to find those kind of numbers. So Manchester United are keen, and that one is feasible on the player side, but it will ultimately depend on Bayern and whether they're prepared to sanction that outgoing. And it's a weird one because Now Manchester United are keen, but as soon as you get to the summer, obviously you take that kind of name because of his age off the table, and then they'll be hopeful under Ratcliffe that they'll have more budget and time to move in the market, and we'll be able to get an experienced striker for the slightly longer term, because Choupo-Moting, I think, is 34 years of age and almost 35. So it's very much a stopgap. It's that kind of Weghorst or Cavani or
Igalo.
Exactly, yeah, with a slightly older name, but maybe it's only beneficial if you can get it for half a season and then in the summer you move. But that could be one to watch. Sergio Guirassy is another that Manchester United, along with Newcastle, have looked at. There is a challenge because the Stuttgart feeling is that he'll stay. And I think now many sources are hinting that this 17.5 million euros release clause for the winter market has actually expired. It may well have had a mid-window lapse on it, which means that you've also got to negotiate rather than trigger, and that will make Stuttgart even less likely to do business. But I've always been told that Manchester United would have strongly considered moving for Guirassy if they felt that the player would be willing to come mid-season, but he's on such fire for Stuttgart that stability is key. He's gone off to AFCON as well, so that makes it a little bit harder as well. And the feeling is that he won't be moving mid-season. So Manchester United don't have too many options. I wouldn't rule out them being opportunistic in the final days or hours of the window, but I also think, as pessimistic as it sounds, there's no guarantee that there will be a striker incoming this window at Manchester United, not unless Martial was to leave.
Just moving on a little bit, you mentioned there about the summer, and obviously then you're getting slightly more presumably expensive, slightly younger, slightly more long-term targets on the horizon. How does that work with Erik ten Hag's position at the club? Because obviously United are currently in about as bad a position as we've ever been in at this time of a Premier League season. We're on course for, I know we're still in the FA Cup, but the potential of a trophyless season is a very strong one. We could, again, feasibly have our worst Premier League finish ever, and yet we're expecting a big summer with new owners, big money, big transfers. Do you think Ten Hag will be the man who is not necessarily overseeing, because it sounds like there's a slight change in the structure of who's doing what, but do you think he's going to be the person sort of with access to this money, or do you think it could be another manager, and is that something that Ineos are sort of actively preparing for, do you think?
It's too early to tell because they're doing the strategic review, and the completion process and the strategic review have some overlap. So it's not like they come in and then there's 100 days. I was always told it's a 100-day or so strategic review that will have started and will be completed after they get into the football club, which means by maybe late March, they'll start to know what their summer plans are. And then Erik ten Hag will have had 2 or 3 months working with them. They had a long meeting with Ten Hag, around 3 hours, I was told. And in that meeting, he was told he wouldn't be prejudged. So there's no indication that Ten Hag won't last the season, but football's a results-driven business. And naturally, like any manager, if Manchester United linger in mid-table mediocrity, the manager's going to be under threat. But I think Ineos feel like they need to understand what's the real problem here. Is it the manager? Is it the manager's relationship with the dressing room? Is it the recruitment hierarchy? Is it the wider club structure? And you can't know that until you come in. And that's why Ten Hag may be given more time. Had this takeover or strategic investment, whatever you want to call it, it's not a full takeover, obviously, but it's as good as a full takeover as far as sporting control is concerned, because Ratcliffe and Jean-Claude Blanc and Sir Dave Brailsford will be making the big sports decisions. Had this happened in the summer, then I think as we got the Christmas period, Ten Hag would have been under big threat because they'd have had 3 or 4 months with him. And around that festive period, results were not good enough. But it's almost a stay of potential execution until he's been judged properly, because Ineos will have heard a lot, both through the club and from outside the club, but they won't know the reality. They'll want to understand the Sancho situation, the Martial situation, even though the agent says it's just an injury. Ratcliffe, and wider team will want to get a series of recruitment experts in, probably at least 2 senior names, and then build a structure. Then work out whether Ten Hag is the right fit for that structure. And I think, as Thomas Tuchel found at Chelsea, when you overhaul a old regime, even though the Glazers are still there, to a new kind of sports model, sometimes the manager you inherit is the right fit, and sometimes they aren't. And sometimes you learn very quickly when you're inside, which is why Tuchel, who wasn't a strategic fit and a personality fit, went quite early. And sometimes you feel blessed that you didn't make any rash decisions. So everyone wants an answer and everyone wants a headline and everyone wants to say, why can't you just tell us if Ten Hag is going to stay or go? But Ineos don't know yet whether Ten Hag is going to stay or go, because unlike Manchester United of years gone by, they're not looking to come in and swing an axe at the manager, if you like, first. They're looking to gut the club. If it's overstaffed, streamline it. If it's poorly structured, restructure it. If it's old-fashioned, renovate it and modernize the club. But from executive down, and football's somewhere in the middle. And ultimately, if you start with the foundations and the executives and the strategy and the structure, you work out then whether Ten Hag fits in that structure. So if he goes and loses 5 games running in late February to March, it's always potentially a different story. But they won't sack him just for the sake of change, because Manchester United have consistently done that. They've sacked manager when there's a problem, and the new managers come in and inherited the same dressing room, the same personalities, the same problems, the same lack of modern training facilities compared to down the road at Manchester City, the same kind of old-fashioned or dated stadium. It's a fantastic stadium, by the way, visually, but as you look a little bit closer, you see the leaky roof and so on. So comparative to Spurs, it is dated, it is old-fashioned. So what's actually the problem here? Because maybe one player doesn't pick the club because there's better facilities. Maybe one player doesn't pick the club because they get more consistent Champions League football at another one. But maybe a player doesn't pick the club because they don't like Ten Hag, or maybe someone comes because they love Ten Hag. So there's all kinds of questions. And until you understand the dressing room dynamic, the manager dynamic with the dressing room and independent of the dressing room, and how he fits into the strategy and the structure that still isn't even being built. If you just sack the manager, you're going to get the same problem over and over and over again, which is basically what's happened to Manchester United ever since Alex Ferguson's left. And I think Ineos realised that, and that's where Ratcliffe, being a Manchester United fan, helps. And I suspect them to give Ten Hag, within reason and results, more time, because they want to judge him after they've worked out the structure, not before it.
2 things you mentioned there. I mean, you mentioned a lot of things, and I think it's crucial that they do look at the whole club and not just what's happening on the pitch and in the dugout, which seems to be the only thing United have considered over the last decade. But 2 things you mentioned there. One is Ten Hag's relationship with Anthony Martial, and you mentioned this sort of his agent's line of it's just an injury, but could you elaborate slightly more on that? And secondly, you mentioned as well potentially 2 or more people in the sort of back room and the recruitment side of the club, or maybe sports director. Is there any names that you know that United are keen on? Dan Ashworth has been mentioned, Paul Mitchell, another one that's been mentioned. So Ten Hag and Martial, and also are there any names or sort of hints as towards who we could be looking at in terms of sporting directors or that sort of role?
Yeah, I think sporting director and head of recruitment, or sporting director, technical director, will be the 2. Titles don't really matter, but 2 senior people to work collaboratively and collectively. They could go down the Chelsea line and have co-sporting directors, but I doubt it. And as I've reported many times, as have a lot of other top journalists, Dan Ashworth remains one to watch. It's still unclear whether he would consider leaving Newcastle, but Ineos know him well. And again, when people say, why can't you move that story along, it's because Ashworth hasn't even been approached yet, because Ineos are focused on getting in first. So this is probably going to be a February, March type thing. But Ashworth is high on the list. Paul Mitchell is still absolutely there as well. I know we saw some reports in Italy saying he's got a job lined up at Roma. My understanding is that Mitchell is very firmly still in the mix, and Manchester United are not concerned that they are going to lose out on Mitchell because he takes any job before they have the opportunity to present something to him. If Manchester United want Mitchell, they feel that they can get Mitchell, and they felt that for months, really, but they've not been able to advance anything because they hadn't done the deal with the Glazers. So Ashworth's a bit different because Mitchell's a free agent, and obviously Ashworth would have to decide if he wants to leave Newcastle. But those are still 2 names to watch, and it's not impossible that they end up working together. I think Dougie Freeman is still there as well as a possibility, not in my opinion for sporting director talking to sources, but some kind of senior recruitment role. Some have mentioned Berta as well, who's a slightly newer candidate. And I think there is validity to consideration there, because it will probably be a 5 to 7 man and woman shortlist before there's determination as to who the 1 or the two are. And if they are going to get two, it will be about how they coexist. So the personalities and their experience working in a more collaborative team will be very important. And then on the other side, it's perhaps more interesting, because if you move it away from these football appointments and think about CEO, for example, that's technically still a Glazers appointment, because CEO is not football only. CEO is obviously a role that encompasses everything. So the Glazers would have significant input. And my understanding now, even though it wasn't perhaps the case a few months ago, is that the decision has been near taken, not 100%, but maybe like 90% taken, that Jean-Claude Blanc will not carry the role of CEO and instead will maintain his title as CEO of Ineos Sport, being a bit more bigger picture. And then the CEO and Blanc will have a relationship. But I think that it's complicated because CEO can report to a number of people, possibly Blanc, but then Ineos have basically got quite a lot of control over the business side. So you would still imagine that Joel Glazer in particular would want the CEO also co-reporting to him. And it's these kind of discussions that are going to have to be ironed out. And it's too early to really say definitively what direction the Glazers and Ineos are going to go in. Is it going to be an Ineos person, or is it going to be a Glazers person? But either way, what I think we can sort of say is that it's clear Brailsford is going to be left to the sporting side, working as the key delegated representative of Ratcliffe. And then Blanc is going to be on the sports business side, which means that he will be a really important person to sit between almost Ineos and the Glazers, and maybe even shield Brailsford at times. So I would expect a very strong relationship between Blanc and the Glazers, and obviously Ratcliffe and the Glazers. And then Brailsford won't maybe get sucked into as much Glazer-specific or brand-specific stuff. And that's where Blanc's perfect. He's worked at big clubs. He's seen a political club like PSG. He's incredibly well respected and liked. He's perfect to be that bridge. Because everyone asks, how's it going to work when the Glazers control the brand and Ineos control football? And the answer is probably Blanc, sitting between the two, being an amenable, personable character, and being able to manage on a near day-to-day that relationship. Then as far as the CEO is concerned, I'm told that there's several candidates already being touted, including a number of names within the Premier League. And there's maybe a feeling on the Ineos side that it's very helpful, regardless of who they pick, to see who from the CEO side with heavy Premier League experience and well-run clubs could come in. So, for example, I'm told, even though no approach has been made, so he won't even necessarily be aware of this in a formal sense, but I'm told Paul Barber at Brighton is one name that is liked and could be under consideration. But it's so early. There's a shortlist, and that shortlist will, again, not materialize until later in the year, because Patrick Stewart's doing a great job as interim. He knows the club, he knows the culture, he's well respected. I think it's unlikely that he would get the job permanently, but it wouldn't surprise me, even though sources have always indicated there's maybe not enough experience there for him to take that role. It still wouldn't surprise me if he gets the courtesy of an interview, and he'll be a really vital part of the transitional process. And everyone says that he's done a great job and is highly respected and has been very important whilst this takeover is being completed and whilst it was being negotiated, in, again, bridging the gap, helping with the transition, keeping everybody informed within the club, and ultimately working very closely with Ineos. And if there is a new CEO, he'll play a big role in sort of helping them to shadow themselves in too. So it's still all very early stages, but it's clear that Ineos are not just waiting to come in. They're doing half of their almost strategic review now. Then they'll be in mid to early February. And then the other sort of 40, 50 days of this 100-day review will ensue. And that's when I start to think we may see a flurry of approaches to get some of these executive appointments done.
Excellent. And I know you've got to go, Ben, so we'll have to leave the Martial question for next time. But I'm sure we'll find out within the next 11 days or so exactly what is going on there. Thank you so much. Thank you for your expertise and input there. Thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for watching at home as well. This has been a one-on-one interview with football correspondent Ben Jacobs. Thanks very much.